For generations, long before English ships ever reached the sandy barrier islands of what is now North Carolina, the Croatoan people had already built a life along those shores. They knew the currents, the shifting inlets, and the seasonal patterns of a coastline that could swallow an unprepared ship whole. They also knew something else, something that would only become relevant to history decades later. They knew how to survive on land that outsiders consistently failed to understand. In the summer of 1587, an English expedition of more than 100 men, women, and children arrived on Roanoke Island, hoping to establish a permanent colony in the New World. Within 3 years, every single one of them would vanish without a confirmed trace, leaving behind only a handful of clues and a single carved word that has haunted historians ever since. That word was Croatoan, carved into a wooden post at the entrance of the abandoned settlement. To the English who found it, that word was assumed to be a message, a location, possibly even a plea for help pointing toward a nearby island where a group calling themselves the Croatoan lived. But no rescue expedition ever confirmed what became of the colonists once that word was found. No further search was properly completed, and more than 4 centuries later, one question remains unresolved. Did the Croatoan know exactly what happened to those English settlers and simply never have the opportunity or the reason to tell anyone who was listening? Today, we're examining the historical record, the archaeological evidence, and above all, the Croatoan and broader Algonquian oral traditions that most retellings of the Roanoke mystery leave out entirely. To understand why the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists continues to fascinate people more than 400 years later, we have to start earlier than 1587. Long before English ships anchored off the Outer Banks, the Croatoan and their neighboring Algonquian-speaking communities had established complex, well-organized societies across the coastal plain of what would later be called Virginia and North Carolina. They farmed maize, beans, and squash. They fished the sounds and rivers with practiced skill, and they maintained extensive trade and diplomatic relationships with neighboring peoples, including groups the English would later come to know and frequently mistrust, such as the Socotan and the more powerful inland confederacy led by a paramount chief named Wingina. The English, by contrast, arrived with almost none of that practical knowledge. Their first attempt to settle the region in 1585 had already ended in near disaster, saved largely by resupply voyages, and, according to several accounts, by the tolerance of local communities who had far more reason to remove the newcomers than to help them. Relations between the English and the surrounding Algonquian peoples had already grown tense by the time a second group of colonists arrived in 1587, this time intending to stay permanently rather than simply garrison the island. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through indigenous tradition, colonial records, and unresolved mysteries, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep researching stories like this one. Because what happened after that second group of colonists settled in was never simply a story about an empty fort and a single carved word. It was the beginning of a mystery shaped just as much by what the English failed to record as by what actually happened on that island. When John White led the second group of colonists to Roanoke Island in July of 1587, he was not arriving at untouched ground. He was returning to the site of the previous failed settlement, a location the surrounding Algonquian communities already associated with broken promises and violent confrontation. Only 2 years earlier, English soldiers stationed on the island had killed a local leader under disputed circumstances and destroyed at least one village in retaliation for a missing silver cup. That history did not disappear simply because a new group of colonists had arrived with different intentions. Within weeks of landing, tensions escalated further. A colonist named George Howe was killed while searching for crabs near an inlet, an event colonial records attribute to conflict with nearby communities still hostile toward the English presence. Understanding how precarious their position had become, the colonists convinced John White to sail back to England for urgently needed supplies, leaving behind roughly 115 men, women, and children, including White's own daughter and infant granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child recorded as born in the Americas. White intended to return within months. Instead, War between England and Spain delayed his voyage for 3 full years. When he finally returned to Roanoke Island in August of 1590, he found the settlement completely abandoned. The houses had been carefully dismantled rather than destroyed by violence, suggesting a deliberate, organized departure rather than a sudden attack. Heavy iron objects and other supplies had been buried, apparently in hopes of retrieving them later. And at the entrance to the settlement, carved into a wooden post, was a single word, Croatoan. White had left specific instructions before his departure. If the colonists were forced to relocate, they were to carve their destination into a visible location, and if that departure had happened under distress, they were to carve a cross above it. No cross was found. To White, that detail suggested the colonists had left Roanoke voluntarily and safely, likely relocating to Croatoan Island, roughly 50 miles south, where a community of Croatoan people maintained friendly relations with the English throughout the earlier expeditions. By every reasonable interpretation available to White at the time, the message seemed to answer the mystery before it had even fully formed. The colonists had gone to stay with the Croatoan. All that remained was to sail there and confirm it. But a violent storm damaged White's ships before he could make the journey, and with his crew refusing to risk further delay, he was forced to return to England without ever setting foot on Croatoan Island. He would never return to the Americas again, and no other Englishman would properly investigate the settlement's fate for years afterward, by which point the trail, quite literally, had gone cold. What followed was not a rescue mission, but decades of second-hand rumors, contradictory reports from later expeditions describing English-appearing individuals living among various Algonquian communities, and a growing colonial narrative that framed the story as one of tragedy and loss rather than one of a plausible, peaceful relocation that had simply never been formally confirmed. That distinction matters enormously, because the version of the Roanoke story most people know today, one built around vanishing settlers and an unsolved disappearance, was shaped almost entirely by English assumptions, English record-keeping, and English retellings. The Croatoan themselves, the very people whose name was carved into that post, whose island the colonists most likely relocated to, and whose oral traditions may have preserved exactly what happened next, were rarely, if ever, formally asked. Long after John White's failed return voyage, English colonial expansion continued along the Virginia and Carolina coastlines, and with it came scattered reports that hinted at what may have happened to the missing colonists. In 1608, colonists at the newly established Jamestown settlement recorded testimony describing gray-eyed individuals living among certain Algonquian communities, along with reports of people who reportedly built houses in a style resembling English construction, rather than traditional wetu or longhouse structures. Captain John Smith himself recorded rumors of surviving colonists living somewhere inland, protected by local communities rather than held captive by them. None of these accounts were ever formally verified. Colonial record-keeping during this period was inconsistent at best, shaped heavily by rumor, translation difficulties, and the priorities of men more interested in securing new territory than resolving the fate of a previous, failed venture. But taken together, these fragments suggest something quite different from the popular narrative of total disappearance. They suggest gradual absorption, intermarriage, and integration into existing communities, a far less dramatic outcome, but arguably a far more plausible one given the practical realities the colonists would have faced. For decades, this possibility remained a footnote buried within colonial archives. It was the Croatoan and their descendant communities, particularly the Lumbee people of present-day Robeson County, North Carolina, who preserved a very different account, one passed down not through English documentation, but through generations of oral history. According to Lumbee oral tradition, ancestors of the community include English colonists who intermarried with local Algonquian-speaking peoples following the failure of the Roanoke settlement. Surnames matching those recorded on the original 1587 colonist roster, including Dare, Cooper, and Sampson, have persisted within Lumbee family lines for generations, long before any formal historical investigation connected the two groups. Modern archaeological research has added further support to this interpretation. Excavations conducted near Hatteras Island believed to be the historical location of Croatoan territory, have uncovered English artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including a signet ring, gun parts, and fragments of English pottery, found alongside Algonquian tools and household items in a manner suggesting shared use rather than conquest or conflict. Rather than pointing toward violence or disappearance, this physical evidence points toward daily coexistence. Before we continue, if documentaries built on overlooked indigenous testimony and the historical record behind colonial mysteries are the kind of content you enjoy, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep uncovering stories most retellings leave out. What makes this pattern particularly striking is how consistently it has been minimized in the broader cultural memory of Roanoke. The story most widely told treats the colony's fate as an enduring, unanswerable riddle, a haunting historical dead end. But the evidence assembled from Lumbee oral tradition, colonial secondhand reports, and physical archaeology tells a far more coherent story, one in which the Croatoan and their neighboring communities did exactly what their historical relationship with the earlier failed colony suggested they might do. They took in people who had nowhere else to survive. If that is what happened, then the mystery of Roanoke was never truly a mystery to the people who lived along that coastline. It was simply never asked, and for centuries, never properly listened to when it finally was. More than 4 centuries have passed since John White stood at the entrance of an empty settlement, staring at a single carved word with no way to confirm what it truly meant. During those centuries, historians have written extensively about the lost colony, treating it as one of the great unsolved mysteries of early American history. Books, documentaries, and even an annual outdoor drama performed on Roanoke Island itself have kept the story alive in the public imagination, almost always centered on the perspective of the vanished English settlers. Yet despite all of that attention, the story has never fully reckoned with an uncomfortable possibility. That there was no true disappearance at all, only a relocation that colonial record-keeping failed to properly document, and an indigenous community whose knowledge of that relocation was never seriously pursued, translated, or believed by the very people who most needed the answer. The evidence, when considered together, points toward a far less mysterious and far more human outcome. A carved word left with clear intent, no cross indicating distress. A nearby island historically home to a community already friendly toward the colonists. Secondhand reports of gray-eyed individuals living among Algonquian communities, surnames matching the original colonist roster persisting for generations within Lumbee family lines, and archaeological sites showing English and Algonquian artifacts used side by side rather than divided by violence. None of these facts alone solves the mystery completely. Together, they form a pattern difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The Croatoan perspective adds a dimension that rarely receives attention in mainstream retellings. For the Croatoan and their descendant communities, this was never framed as a mystery requiring dramatic resolution. It was, according to preserved oral tradition, simply what happened. People in need were taken in, families formed, communities blended. The drama exists almost entirely on the English side of the story, a reflection of incomplete records rather than an unresolved reality. That distinction matters because it reframes the entire question at the heart of this story. The mystery of Roanoke was never a mystery of what happened. It may have always been a mystery of who was asked, and who was listened to once an answer was actually given. Perhaps that is the most important lesson buried within this story, more significant than any single artifact or carved word. Colonial history was written almost entirely by those who left records behind, while the communities who may have held the clearest answers were rarely considered credible sources at all. The Croatoan never vanished from history. They simply were never fully written into the version most people were taught. History has not provided an absolute, universally accepted answer. What it has provided is a coastline, a carved word, generations of oral tradition, and a pattern of evidence that continues pointing in the same direction, even as popular retellings continue treating the story as an unsolved riddle rather than a resolution hiding in plain sight. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed documentaries that explore forgotten history through indigenous tradition, colonial records, and the questions historians left unanswered, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Roanoke colonists truly vanished, or do you think the Croatoan and their descendants have known the answer all along? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.